Good evening all and welcome. Tonight's video is going to have us delving into the world of ghosts and the paranormal, and I'd like to thank Jacqueline, who made today's thumbnail as an artwork submission. If you have some artwork that you would like to submit, feel free to send it to my email, and it could make it into a video. Also, the longest story in the video is actually an excerpt from a book by Jordan Taylor Quinn Farkas. If you're interested in reading more of his works, I'm going to leave a link in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. In my childhood home, there were always weird things that happened. Bumps in the night, pots and pans clanking, floors moaning. Around the age of 10 or so, things started to get worse. Our living room and dining room were connected. They were basically one giant room. The dining room had a push-button dimmer light. It had to be physically pushed in for the light to come on, and it made a distinct click when it was pushed. My stepmother was out on a business trip, so it was me, my sister, and my father all watching TV in the living room with our backs to the dining room, when all of a sudden, the button makes the click noise, and the light turns on. We all look at each other in disbelief, more specifically my sister and I. My father seemed more curious than anything. I specifically remember feeling sick to my stomach after it happening. Something just didn't feel right. I could see in my sister's eyes that it didn't feel right with her either. My father investigated it and chalked it up to some electrical malfunction, but my sister and I both heard the click of the button. Things began to get weirder after that. There would be a good bit of time in between things, but they continued to happen for a few years. Sometimes before I fell asleep, a shadowy figure would come into my room. Sometimes I would see it in the corner, sometimes at the foot of my bed, and other times it would be next to me. I never feared it, and I never told anyone because who would believe it? Eventually it progressed. I would wake up and see it in the corner of the room, on the ceiling, and it started to become more distinct. It was missing a chunk of its head, and its eyes were black. Its nose looked like what you'd see for someone whose face was decayed, and its mouth was black. Now I became more intrigued as to who and why, but I didn't pay it any attention. It started to wake me up in the middle of the night. It would never hurt me or anything, but I still don't sleep with my feet out from under the covers, and it's been 15 years. It would show up next to me and just be there for a minute. I would look up and back at it, and eventually it would go away. Eventually it started getting on the bed. It would wake me up and be right in front of my face, and I mean directly in front, looking at me with its mouth or lack thereof, and its black holes for eyes staring into me. I'd close my eyes for a second and open them, and it would still be there. For some reason I refused to move at all when it all happened. I'd remain very still and would just let it pass. It wasn't like I was paralyzed or anything, but my curiosity wanted to see what it would do, and every time it would wake me up and be at my face, and it would eventually just disappear into the dark. As time went on, I began waking up with scratches on my stomach, my back and my legs. I knew it couldn't have been me scratching myself because I chew my nails to the point where there are none, always have, and it was always 3 scratch marks. The worst one went from my right shoulder across my chest and down my left hip diagonally across my body. The last time that I saw it, I woke up, and it was at the side of my bed, and this time it appeared bigger, taller. It stood there for a second this time, and I physically couldn't move. My legs and arms felt like they were 1,000 pounds apiece. The figure then started to lean over the bed, and it began to disappear into my body. The whole thing took a few seconds and it was all over, and never happened again after that. 8 years later, it's Christmas time, and the whole family is at my sister's house. We all have a few drinks and start talking about old times. The subject comes up about my parents' old house being haunted. Naturally, my parents are poking fun at me and my sister for discussing the different weird things that happened there. Now, like I said, I'd never told anyone about the figure, because who would believe me, right? Then my sister says, "And the figure that would come in the night? The face?" I interrupted her and said, "The one with the blacked out eyes and mouth and no nose?" She looks at me in disbelief and says, "Oh my God, yes, that one." We had discussed it for a little bit, and then moved on. I think the creepiest part is the validation of such a weird childhood memory. The house I lived in from birth until I was 11 was pretty close to a hospital for the mentally ill. Nothing like an Outlast or House on the Hill, and it's been shut down for a good few years and turned into houses. My parents worked there. My mum is a psychiatric nurse and my dad worked on the wards, where the guys were deviants, so they'd do stuff like eat sheets and play in their own filth, scratch off their lips, stuff like that. We lived in a house about 500 yards away. From an early age, my parents tell me I'd be heard laughing uncontrollably. This lasted until I was 2, when I'd have full-blown conversations, as much as a 2-year-old could, and I vividly remember a kid making shapes with his hand in the light, which would set me off. I used to draw on the walls of my room next to my bed. I seemingly was obsessed with drawing police cars and crowds of people chasing a man. At first, my drawings were unintelligible, but as I approached 4 or 5 they were getting better, and that's when my parents remember me drawing, always police cars chasing a man. I showed no interest in police or playing cops and robbers outside of this. I played with the kids. I believed one of the funniest things that happened was he locked me in a coal shed from the outside. He told me to get inside, so I did, and then ran away. My mum heard me screaming and asked how I got in there, as there was only one way to lock it from the outside, and they did not believe me that it was this kid. This is where it gets freaky. As I aged, I grew out of taking notice of this person who seemed to frequent my room. I awoke one night, I think I was around 6, to a loud bang downstairs. My parents' room was across the landing, so I walked across, looked down at the stairs, and was frozen in terror. We had a draft excluder that was like a snake. It was hanging on the door handle of the front, swinging. There was a man slowly walking up the stairs, and I screamed and the man went away. I heard a voice telling me to come here, and I passed out and woke up in my bed as if it were a dream. I woke up the next day and saw the snake still on the handle, and it freaked me right out. My parents didn't tell me until I was much older, before we'd lived there, that a man had escaped from the hospital, come to the house, stolen a kid, took him back, and hidden him in a shed on the hospital site for 2 days before he was found. When I was in my teens, my family went for a retreat to an old bungalow near the sea. There was a huge mango tree at the side of the garden. I woke up at 3 a.m. due to being in unfamiliar surroundings and noticed my dad outside of the garden staring at the mango tree. I couldn't get back to sleep, so I joined my dad out on the garden. We kept looking at those big, juicy mangoes located very high up the tree, and at the time I thought it would be a great idea to climb up and pluck some at 3 in the morning. I climbed up to about 15 feet, started plucking those mangoes when my dad collected them from down below. While I was trying to reach a particular mango on a faraway branch, I felt like my hair fell down covering half my face, so I absent-mindedly tucked it behind my ears. As I tried to reach it again, it fell down covering part of my face again. Then I froze. Since when did my hair get so long? I didn't dare look up, and kept staring down at my dad, who was busy picking up mangoes and didn't have a clue to what was going on. Slowly I made my way back down, and only plucked up the courage to look up once both my feet were firmly planted on the ground. I didn't manage to see anything. That's when I heard the faint female laughter coming from up the tree. This happened to a friend a few years back. Back then we had a habit of going for walks at night by my dorm school. He didn't live very far, so after walking me back, he walked home through a newly built park connector that took about half-hour to get to his area. This was past midnight and I was chilling in my dorm room when he called and sounded really freaked out. He rambled that he'd been walking for close to an hour and hadn't reached any of the landmarks that the signs along the path mentioned, the whole X meters until some road, etc. The whole area was empty, and even the houses lining the park were quiet and dark, and there was no noise, crickets, animals, anything. After a while on the call, he told me he finally exited into a road into a neighborhood he didn't recognize. It was still empty, but there was a taxi at the side of the road. The car was running after peeking in, and there was no one in it. He continued walking, and after a bit, the taxi suddenly slowly drove off. Long story short, he eventually ended at the main road. I didn't think he was making it up, because he's not the sort to do so. He went back to the area again, and actually encountered something. I forgot the details of what happened there, but he managed to take a picture. What it looked like was a shadow figure, human-shaped silhouette melting into the ground. It was certainly very strange. This happened to my ex-stepbrother, 16 or more years ago. When I was around 13, my dad had taken a job in another state about 4 hours away. He would stay in an apartment during the week and would come home on his weekends off. A few years later, my older stepbrother, around 17 at the time, began seeing what he claimed was an old woman around our local home. She would never do anything malicious, but she only presented herself to him. It would often be times when he was home alone. This went on for a few months. Nothing more than your typical, "what do you want?" conversations. He said she would speak to him, most times saying that she was getting taller and mundane statements like that. One night, while me, my younger stepbrother, and stepmother were visiting my father, we get a call from my older stepbrother. He was frantically telling my dad that he needed to get his hunting rifles out of his truck and lock them up inside. The odd part here is that my dad never left hunting rifles in his vehicle. At first my dad shrugged it off, thinking maybe he had just mentioned in passing that he had left them in there in that morning. Then he started to wonder why he would be calling so late, and why he sounded so panicky. While my dad went out to recover the guns, my stepmother asked what Brandon, the older stepbrother's problem was. He said that the old lady had woken him, telling him that Randy, my dad, needed to get the guns into the house. She apparently told him that if he didn't, Brian, my younger stepbrother, was going to get hurt. After this, my stepbrother never spoke of the woman again. We assumed she never came back. A more heartwarming tale involves my ex-stepmother's mum. She was dying of lung cancer, and while she was in hospice care, she would stare out the window and watch hummingbirds feed from a dispenser just outside the window. The day of her funeral, a pure white hummingbird hung around the flowers at the head of her casket for the entire service. Back in 2001, I left for college and my family moved into a house on a lake. My younger siblings were kids at the time and claimed they would see handprints appear along the wall in the downstairs hallway, so they generally avoided hanging out there. Since I never really lived in the house after college, I completely forgot about it. Fast forward to this past November. COVID-19 is raging, so I flew back home to be with my parents since the bi-level house allowed me to quarantine for 2 weeks downstairs. During my isolation, I started to feel a really deep gratitude that we had this house right now, that allowed me to be with my family safely. I would periodically walk up and down the hallway, placing my hand along the walls and saying a little thank you prayer. It was maybe the third or fourth time I did this, when I suddenly remembered the story of the handprints from years ago. Pretty interstellar, if you ask me. A few years ago I went to a Christmas party. That night my housemates went home earlier, while I decided to stay and get into the Christmas spirit with a few other friends. I ended up getting pretty hammered and got home around 3 a.m. But instead of going straight to bed, I got another beer inside and went out to the back porch to have a smoke and look at the stars. I was outside a few minutes when I see a light go on in the kitchen. My housemate comes out and looks at me out the back. I wave and generally look like a drunk idiot. I thought he was going to come out and get a debrief on the rest of the evening, as there were some good laughs we had irrelevant to the story. Anyway, he just gets a glass of water and goes to bed. I finish my beer and join him. The next morning we're rehashing the previous night when he mentions getting up and seeing me have a smoke out back. Who came back from the party with you? I give him a sideways look and reply, no one, dude, I was out there alone. He insists, nah man, there was someone out there with you, behind you on the porch, when you were looking inside waving. I didn't come out because I thought it was going to be the random friend at the Christmas party I didn't know. I couldn't be bothered to make introductions. To this day, he stands by this version of the events. Whoever it was must have been standing nearby, because I saw no one and heard nothing. Gives me the willies each time I think about it. My dad had this habit of knocking his fingers on the wall in our hallway as he walked by, and he had a crackly toe. Together it made a very distinctive sound. We always knew when we were in trouble by the tempo of that sound. My older brother had a kid a few years after my dad died one night, while I'm babysitting, and the kid upstairs is in her crib about 18 months, over the monitor. I can tell she's not napping anymore, but she seems to be occupying herself. Then I hear that noise that my dad used to make, and she giggles. It took me a minute to recognize that sound, but when I did, I went upstairs. The door to her room had been closed when I put her down, but now it was open, and she was standing at her crib, looking at the far corner, but there was nothing there. My oldest could talk before she could walk. As a toddler, she always got excited when we invited people over for a party. One particular 4th of July gathering, when her godfather made his usual appearance, she was so excited to see him that she ran to him yelling, "Uncle Tony, Uncle Tony!" Her loud screeches of delight caught my attention, but I wondered who she was yelling for. I saw my brother-in-law scoop her up in his arms, and saw the whole exchange. But who was Uncle Tony? When I caught my husband's attention, I asked, "Who's Uncle Tony?" He answered in a flat tone, "Chucky." I must have had quite a confused look on my face because he quickly explained that his brother, who we've always called Chucky, Rachel's uncle, who was holding her now, had the name the family never used. His name is Anthony, he said, and was named after his own father. He's the only one who called him Tony. Now at this point I had known my brother-in-law for more than 10 years. I even worked with him a few years in the same office and never once heard Chucky called Anthony, or Tony for that matter. I walked over to Rachel and Chucky and asked if he had told her his real name. He answered, "No, why would I?" To this day she still calls him Uncle Tony. She's the only one in the family that does. Her grandfather must have told her this well-kept family secret. After all, he was the one who had given his first son his name. But there's just one problem with this idea. Granddad has been dead for over 40 years. Ghosts, spirits, and other bodiless entities have been an interest of mine since childhood. Among the books I often checked out from the library in my hometown back in the day, ghost stories were a sure thing to be found in my stacks. The subject has always intrigued me, though I can honestly say I never really expected to encounter any disembodied spirits myself. But boy was I wrong. Of all the unbelievable encounters that I've experienced over the years, ghosts, spirits, and shapeless entities have been a recurring thing. The first experience happened in 2012. That particular winter took a toll on my soul, it really did. Jess and I were renting an apartment located in a small town in East Tennessee. It wasn't the greatest of neighborhoods, to say the least. There were lots of drugs in and out, for sure. The entire town was pretty bad as far as I was concerned. so there wasn't much to do for it. Anywhere you rented, an apartment was just as affiliated as the next. I was deep into my studies at the time and struggled to find work due to an injury I had sustained the year before. I basically had way too much time on my hands for thinking, and everywhere I looked, I saw drugs. The little town of Tazewell was a cesspool of needles and melted down high-grade opiates. Out of the 20-something apartments in a one-block radius from mine, well over a dozen of them were heavy drug users, thieves, liars, cheats, conmen, or low to mid-level dealers. In the year that I lived in that apartment, there were 3 deaths by overdose. Needles were involved each time. It was a thick and sickly atmosphere to live in, one that I do not miss at all and hope to never be subjected to again. And now that the background has been put out the way, let's get on to the story. It was early spring. My other half and I had both been managing a little pizza place down the road. I had just left the job a few weeks before I had this dream. Sometimes things in life happen that you can't accurately describe the importance of to others who didn't experience what was involved. This was one of those times. In my dream, I woke up in my apartment, and it looked exactly as it did in real life. I was in my bed, and so I sat up and looked around. There was a man nearby, and he looked directly at me. I could also tell that he was in a great deal of pain from the look in his eyes and the grim facial expression he wore. I should have gone to the hospital, he wailed at me without breaking eye contact. I didn't understand what he meant by this, other than obviously he felt like he should have gone to the hospital. The statement and the desperation in his voice made me take a better look at him. He was very thin, much too thin to be remotely healthy. He was tall, lanky and bony, with long dark greasy hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in ages that fell past his shoulders, with sunken eyes with dark rings round them. It was a very sad sight. I was reminded of the friends around the way, constantly strung out, constantly depressed, losing weight and looking like and feeling like crap. Bless them. He repeated his catchphrase, "I should have gone to the hospital," and then with palms up he stretched his arm out to me. Almost immediately I began to understand. A large black abscess on each arm, where the arm bends on the opposite side of the elbow. It is a preferred place people stick themselves with the needles full of drugs. This was a phantom that had overdosed. He had shot up some drugs into his veins, probably missed a few times being so messed up, which caused abscesses on each arm. He'd most likely perished from the untreated wounds. That's why he kept repeating the bit about having gone to the hospital. When I woke up from the dream, I felt sort of sick. I felt sad, very sad. It felt so real, as if he'd been sitting there in the room chatting with me. I could not shake the dream from my mind. The look of the man, the sound of his voice, the sadness and the regret. I couldn't erase the image of his pleading eyes, arms stretched out towards me, gigantic sores larger than 50-cent pieces on each arm and black as night. The experience left me with a very ghostly feeling. I was so affected by the dream of the dead man that later that day, when I was visiting one of the residents who had been living in the area for 2 decades, I couldn't help but mention it. Barb and I were good friends. She had become something like a mother to me. If I ever needed anything, she had it. It was mine without question, and that went both ways. Lovingly, I came to call her Ma, as many of those who she cared for did. We developed an unbreakable bond during those times and still share it to this day. I was sitting on her couch telling her about the dream, when halfway through it her demeanor changed slightly, and I saw her go sort of stiff. By the end of me explaining the dream, her face had gone white, and a few beads of sweat had popped up on her forehead. I told her that it had felt so real that I couldn't get past the feeling of it actually being real, as if it had happened, as if I had actually held a conversation with this man. Taking a long draw on her cigarette, eyes larger than normal behind her glasses, she looked me straight in the face and went to tell me it was more than likely to be real. A man named Marty had lived in one or more of the apartments on the block before he had passed away, not before I moved into the area. She told me that I had described the way he looked during his final months perfectly, minus the gigantic black sores on the crooks of his arms. I could barely believe what she told me. Marty had laid in the apartment for 3 days before his body was found. He had indeed overdosed and was found with a needle beside him. I was simply stunned at the news. She also let me know that he had not been a bad man, but that he had merely lost his way to drugs. A story that practically the entirety of eastern Tennessee is familiar with, due to the high volume of drug use in the region ever since the collapse of the coal industry and the good old American farm culture drying up. She went on to tell me that his daughter Katie and most of his friends had abandoned him due to his drug-fueled downward spiral months before he perished. That is when I realized that I actually knew Katie, a chipper 18-year-old girl I had worked with only a few weeks ago at the pizza place in town where I had been the manager. She had even mentioned being distant from her drug-using father shortly before his death, and I recalled making the connection. I was sort of shocked at the coincidence, and then began to think that it was perhaps no coincidence after all. I think Marty may have somehow felt his daughter's energy through me, or for some other unknown reason believed I may have helped him move on perhaps. Ma and I discussed this, and I decided to try something I had only dabbed with a few times. I would perform some recording attempting to contact Marty, and play back the footage in the hopes of discovering some EVP. I returned to my apartment, and using my cell phone for a recording device, I walked around, lighting candles in each room and burning incense. I turned on several electronics including lights, space heaters and a TV, and did this in the hopes of providing a bit of energy that a ghost may be able to use in order to charge. I remember hearing that spirits could possibly manifest with the help of excess electricity. I stood in the center of the largest room in the house, which was the living room, and began to question thin air. Is there anyone here? Do any spirits want to show themselves? Walking from room to room, stopping near some electronics or under lights, I repeated the questions and phrases. I finished up my attempts to capture some sort of EVP with a heavy heart. I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary the entire time, and haven't heard anything that sounded like a reply. No bumps, kicks or anything. To my not-so-great surprise, as I listened back over the recording of my inquiry, my ears picked up nothing but the soft white noise of static. After about 15 or 16 minutes into it, I heard a voice that was clear as a bell utter a single word. Marty. As I played the EVP for several people who had no idea about my dream or my interest in Marty, each one of them heard the same voice say the same thing. Marty. After playing the recording for several people, all of which confirmed what I believed I heard, I was left with absolutely zero doubt that he was indeed trapped in my apartment. So shortly after capturing the EVP and discussing the situation further with Ma, who had personally known him, I decided to perform a ritual of sorts to help him move on. Whether or not my attempts to help him accept his fate and forgive himself in order to move on were a success or not, I can't say for sure, but I never heard from him or dreamed of him again. And I also noticed, soon after, that part of the overwhelming depression I associated with the neighborhood was gone too. My next story. In the summer of 2008, several years before encountering the ghost of Marty, I had found myself and several companions in East Tennessee, renting an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on the town's old main street. The building we were in had been the original general store of the town in the 1800s. It was an interesting area of the town, if you're into history. Within 2 or 3 blocks from the apartment there must have been more than half a dozen antique shops and buildings that had long since become antiques themselves. I was working as a manager at a local restaurant and was gone a lot of the time. My best friend Sean worked with me and was gone a lot of the time as well. Our other 2 roommates at the time were in between jobs and so spent a great deal more time alone in the apartment. They would tell Sean and I strange stories about the apartment that I didn't know if either one of us believed at first. They would say things like how they had heard the front door open and close by itself when it had been locked with a key and deadbolt. They said they would hear footsteps from the front door leading to the bathroom, or from the bathroom to one of the bedrooms. Supposedly they would even hear voices as well. Twice they told us that they had been in the bathroom and heard the front door unlock and open and then close, footsteps approaching the bathroom, and then actually had a conversation with one of us through the door, thinking that we had come back home early. And then supposedly, when they came out of the bathroom, no one would be there, and the door to the apartment would still be locked. I believed something was happening, but didn't quite believe the stories about them talking to someone or something through the bathroom door or bedroom door after hearing it unlock the front door lock and deadbolt and just waltz right into our apartment like it lived there. Well, like it was me. Sean was a skeptic too. At this point, he did not particularly care for either of our or other two roommates, past the basic level of mutual respect, but put up with it for my sake. Needless to say, he was not putting much stock into what they were saying. One day, I was off work with Jess while Sean and the other roommates were at work and had walked across town for one reason or another. We had locked the door when we left, and it was locked when we returned, but the living room was completely discombobulated. Books and papers on the floor, other items knocked on their sides or laying at odd angles, and yet other things had definitely been rearranged with what appeared to be great care. The oddest thing to me was that the couch cushions were all standing/leaning together in a strange manner, stacked in the shape of a W. The coffee table and another piece of furniture were also moved but showed no signs of damage. No one else had a key to the apartment at the time, including Sean and the other roommate. I was the only one who had the key, and I had locked the door for sure. Shortly after the couch cushion incident, I was at the local library on a day off, again with Jess. After browsing around a bit and picking up a few books, we headed to the front desk to check them out. I don't recall exactly how the conversation came up, but Jess and the somewhat elderly librarian began discussing our apartment. She said she knew where it was because her niece had lived there but had moved out because she believed it to be haunted. That she would hear voices, footsteps, and had even come home to discover the couch cushions standing at weird angles and things in the living room rearranged. I couldn't believe it. She had just validated the experiences my roommates, as well as myself, had had. A month or two passed from the time of the library trip, and I was coming home from work late one night, around midnight, and was dead tired. I had walked from the store to get some fresh air and wake up a bit after my long shift. It was only a mile or so, but I was exhausted. I pulled open the front door of the building and started up the old steps to the 3rd floor, after fantasizing about sitting down and taking my shoes off and just relaxing. About halfway up the stairs, though, a sinister feeling began creeping up my spine. Now, I am not afraid of the dark, but at that moment I wished the hallway had better light, as the only illumination in the staircase was cast from a single light bulb at the opposite end of the hallway. I reached the 3rd floor landing, and as soon as I did, something jumped out at me from the shadow. A black shadow, in the shape of a full-grown man. In hindsight, if you placed a black silhouette, like people used for landscaping, in the corner, there atop the stairs, it would have been of a comparable size and colour to what I actually saw, I'm sure. The shadow thing wasted no time rushing towards me from within a dark little nook in front of the apartment number 3, the first one at the top of the odd stairs. But by the time it should have ran into me, though, it simply vanished right back into thin air. Jess had mentioned seeing a shadow man in that long dark hallway multiple times. I assumed, in about a second, that I had just encountered him. That said, I never saw it again, and we ended up moving not very long after that too, so who knows what else I may have experienced given the time to do so. I have many other encounters with ghosts and spirits and such entities. Marty and the haunted apartment in the old general store in Tennessee are more than adequate examples of why I believe in ghosts. Let's see what you make of this next encounter though. The monster in Alice's bedroom. I spent the first part of 2016 at my parents' house in Kentucky, going to school. I was a student in South New Hampshire University. It was during this time that I had a couple of very strange experiences. One, including a possible poltergeist, or even some sort of alien presence. The other, involving the infamous Black Triangle. These two events happened within days of each other, and I have reason to believe that the two incidences are directly related, which is an interesting story in itself. The first of the two bizarre encounters occurred one day when my family and I agreed to switch up the sleeping arrangements in the house. I would be taking the first bedroom atop the stairs, which was my old bedroom. For the past 4 or 5 years, the bedroom had been occupied by Alice. There was nothing strange about the arrangement or any particular reason to expect the situation that would soon unfold. After unpacking a few things and setting up my computer, I piddled around the room for a few hours before deciding to call it a night. A few minutes later, as I relaxed in bed, I was violently rocked from my thoughts of school, of loved ones, and of the future, as one corner post after the other of the old wooden bed lifted up and slammed back down with enormous speed and force. For a moment I couldn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe it was an earthquake, even though they are unheard of in Kentucky, and nothing else seemed to be shaking or moving but me in the bed. The bed continued to buck up and down, throwing me in the air several times, and scaring the hell out of me, until it stopped a few seconds after it began. Although if you ever experience something of that manner, you will more than likely agree that the seconds seems like minutes, as your brain races to connect some sane conclusion about what is actually happening. The entire experience was probably anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds. However, in that seemingly short amount of time, each of the bed's corner posts had come up and down at least a couple of dozen times each. You can imagine how fast and bumpy the ride was. To add to the strangeness of it all, the moment the bed stopped bouncing and tossing me around, the eyes landed on the closest door, which just had a crack in it. The closet door. The hair on my arms immediately raised, my skin pricked up, and I got goosebumps. I had closed that door just a few hours earlier, when I had finished unpacking my stuff. I distinctly remember pulling the door shut after placing a half-empty box on the shelf inside and turning the light off. How it had opened, and what that may indicate, I will never know. That said, I do know how unnerving the closet door being open was to me, considering the bed had just done the impossible. Who knows what else could be possible? The bogeyman in the closet? The monsters under the bed? To be fair, it had felt as if a giant hand gripped the bed and jolted it around as a toddler may do with the bed in a dollhouse. Perhaps monsters were real. At any rate, the experience did not end there. The next night, an equally odd and unnerving circumstance befell me, the whole again preparing for bed. This night, my second night in my old bedroom, I had been listening to something on YouTube and eyeballing the closet from time to time, which makes what happens even freakier. Eventually, as I felt as if I may be able to drift to sleep, which is not the easiest thing to do as I suffer from chronic pain, and removed my earbuds, wrapped them around my phone and set it to the side. After making sure the charger was connected properly, and I wouldn't wake up to a dead phone, I laid back in the bed, pulled the covers up to my chest, flexed my toes and prepared for a good night's sleep. No sooner did I finish stretching, did my body tense back up in shock and disbelief, as the bed once again launched me into the air and back down. This time it wasn't the entire bed bouncing and shaking front to back and side to side though, but 3 extremely hard and forceful thumps against the wooden footboard just inches from my feet. The knocking was so powerful that it rattled the wooden bed frame, and I again came several inches up and off the mattress, like I had the night before, as the foot of the bed lifted a foot or more so from the floor and slammed down 3 times. I imagined an invisible giant standing at the end of my bed, and a field goal kicking the footboard with every ounce of his strength that he could muster, because that's genuinely how it felt. I also again felt the presence of some unseen force, be it entity, creature, or otherwise. I am sure that I was not alone. Something had damn sure knocked the hell out of my bed 2 nights in a row. I'm positive there was something there. What it was, on the other hand, I will never know. Or want to know, for that matter. It wasn't until the next morning, after both occurrences had taken place, that I remembered Alice's regular complaints of scary monsters visiting her room at night and terrifying her. Her stories went mostly ignored though, as I believed my mum more than likely knew deep down that there may have been some truth to it all, with something visiting her room in the dead of night, which happens to be one of my earliest memories, and is an eyebrow-raising encounter on its own, one that left my mum with a deep fear of alien-like beings to this very day. As far as Alice's monsters, I believe they were real. Whether it was her monsters or not, something definitely wanted my attention when I took over her bedroom, and they got it. The experience I shared with Alice, whether it be monsters or otherwise, I can't really say. But what I can say is that it could have been caused by an angry spirit, maybe even a poltergeist. Who knows? Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. If you did, you can let me know down below. It's a fun one. I especially like the wholesome ghost stories. I think they're pretty cool. Also, I'm going to give a shout out to Sharp Edges YouTube channel, link in the description. They also do creepy stuff, who was actually someone who experienced something within this video. Check them out if you fancy. So yes, I do hope that tonight's video was of your liking. Tomorrow I'm going to have another big compilation for you to sink your ears into over the weekend, so make sure you are around for that. Have the bell icon pressed and all of the good stuff. But for now, I am going to bid thee good night. So stay awesome. Thank you to all my lovely members and patrons. You guys mean the world to me. And I'll see you in the next one.